Pardon the interruption. I'm Chris Gehrz, joined by
Sam Mulberry. Chris, this is our second webisode, but really it's kind of our first webisode in terms of
regular webisode.
Really getting into the course. On the first webisode, Amy and I talked about online education, taking online courses. In the first response on discussion board, students talked a little bit about this. You didn't get a chance to share your thoughts, so let's start with that.
Right, and I'd probably just echo everything you said. The main thing that stood out to me that I'm sure we've talked about before is I think every single one of my students has taken an online course before, whether it was in high school or at other colleges, and they transferred in, and some even at Bethel had taken multiple courses.
And that's a change from 2013 when we started this.
Yeah, and so I think in some ways it's, I wonder if some of you kind of wonder, well, what's the big deal? Like, why are we asking this question? Why do you have to think about it? And at the same time, like, I think the difference is big enough, and some of you noted, not having that face-to-face contact, not just with professors, but fellow students. Almost everyone in my groups is basically living at home or traveling over the summer, and so you feel a little bit kind of detached. And I think the other thing is this is a very unusual online course in some ways, and I would guess probably expects maybe more work than even kind of seasoned online students are accustomed to. So I'm glad we started with that. I'm glad in some ways it's not as big a hurdle to jump over. But I guess the thing that didn't make me concerned, but just I think it's something to be aware of, is a lot of people are very busy this summer, right? I mean, like, I've got students doing full-time jobs, multiple jobs, multiple courses, and so. And the main thing to reiterate is just what you all said, which is you just have to set aside time for this. This is not the kind of online course where you can make up lots of assignments in a week. You've got to do things on time. You've got to set aside 2 to 3 hours a day to work on this.
And at this point, they've had a sample of both museum, writing assignments, so you sort of know what a day is going to look like in terms of what the workload looks like.
Yeah, and I think, actually, I've only graded one assignment as we record this, the MLK response, but things were going pretty well. So let me throw that to you, Sam, now that you've seen at least one. Maybe you've started to look at the second.
A little bit
assignment.
At the second one, yeah.
What advice do you have? I mean, what are people doing well? What do people need to work on so far?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the biggest piece of advice, and I wrote this in my feedback. So one thing I would say is read the feedback. For the first essay or two, I frequently, even if you write the full 500 words, I might write more than that back to you. And that's not a bad thing. That even if you got 10 points, I'm hopefully writing a little bit in terms of what is going to make these strong, because part of writing these is to help you prepare for the exam essays. So the biggest piece of advice for me is that there's a difference between a correct answer and a complete answer. You can write, I had some people write kind of 250 word answers total, and everything they wrote was fine, it's just they didn't go into the depth. So how do you make an answer complete? You draw on the readings. So,
and the films.
Readings and films, absolutely. So whatever you're responding to, so quotes, quoting ideas, things like that, I want to see that. Put things in people's words. The easiest way to do this is often is to start with a quote, start your answer with a quote, and then unpack the quote. Then you know you're going to be interacting. The second thing is make sure you go back and look at the question and that you've sort of answered every part of the question. That I saw that especially in the second half of the answers. First ones would be nice and robust. The second one, you would often forget part of the answer, and that hurts students.
Yeah, I'd say exactly the same thing. Often the first part was pretty well developed, and the second part was much weaker. And it's partly because for some students the challenge is like getting up to 350 words. For some students it's only writing 500 words, right? So like I'll focus on that challenge. One of the goals of the course and the curriculum is to help you write concisely about complicated ideas, I think is how it's stated. And I actually think we do better at working on this in summer than we do in fall and spring, and you actually get a lot more constructive feedback in this online course than you would in kind of the regular semester
So what would your
course.
advice be for doing that? Especially if you're somebody who maybe tends to write a lot, how do you get more concise?
So I think the advice I wrote most often was, this is a good first draft, and now you need to edit. I think sometimes, and it's understandable, but sometimes the response is, okay, I've read this reading, I've watched this film, now I'm going to sit down, I'm going to write what's on my mind, and click submit. I think that's often a good way to write, is do a first draft, just kind of get things on paper. I know I've found many times I actually have to write something to think about it. And getting on paper, on screen in this case, is a good first step, but you're also writing something that requires editing. And so in that case, maybe it's you have to write like 700 words to know what you think, but then you've got to get it down. You've got to kind of decide what needs to be there, what are you being repetitive or redundant with. And at least think a little bit about structure. Like, and not so much for these assignments, but because you will be writing like a 4 to 6 paragraph essay on each exam, you've got to think a little bit about paragraph construction. You don't put like 4 ideas into a single rambling paragraph. You've got to think about, what am I trying to say in this paragraph? When is it time to start a new one? How do I get from one to the other? So, we kind of do that for you because we give you 2 relatively small questions to sort of break it up. But even within that, sometimes students will write just a very long, and again, because they're trying to get ideas on paper, but then you've got to think about how to structure
Well, it's
it.
interesting you put it that way, because as I was grading, part of writing is about how well do you communicate. And there were times where I would finish reading and I was like, I'm not sure what you're saying. Yeah. And that's never a good sign if the person grading is like, I'm not quite sure the argument you're trying to make. So
I think mostly this will come through repetition.
Absolutely.
Actually, the first set of responses was really good in my group, and some people have more experience doing this kind of writing. Some it just comes more naturally to. You'll be doing a lot of these, and so if the first 1 or 2 are challenging and you're getting this kind of feedback, it's just one assignment. You're going to do many more of these, and I think you'll get better over time.
So, Chris, at this point, students have not only written a couple reading responses, film responses. We've also done the first museum. Now, we haven't graded those because we're recording this a little bit ahead of that.
Yeah, it's over the weekend.
Right. So what are your thoughts on museums? What advice from having taught this course in the past?
Yeah, maybe this is the most distinctive element, right? And I think often ends up being students' favorite element of it. I'll say I think we got better at designing museums as we went. And so the first one, we were trying some things out. And so the first one, even the worksheet itself, there's a few more points just given to kind of thinking about how you do museums. I think the main thing is understand that, in a sense, these take the place of lectures in the course. In a sense, the documentaries do. The documentaries kind of give you the big arcs of the story. Museums, though, are where you're going to find vocabulary. So, like, you want your worksheet open that you're working on. You also want your study guide open, because the worksheet will ask you for, like, define 3 mastery vocab terms. We'll talk more about those later. But there are like 4 others that you need just for this one part of the
So in a sense, they're sort of like a lecture and sort of like a textbook, too.
A little bit, yeah.
You can use these to kind of look up, here's where, I think about that first museum you guys did. There's parts where here's a bust of a person, and if I listen to the audio, I'm starting to hear what I need to know for a term.
Because I think it's good to think about that just for practical reasons of you're going to be tested on this, and this is how you're getting information. It's also the challenge for museums is it feels like, I have to look at everything, I have to listen to every minute of audio commentary, and that gets overwhelming. And so that becomes the first filter you use to kind of guide what you're looking for. The second filter, I think you all talked about in the first webisode, which is these are meant to be places where you can explore. We all have different interests, and we try to cover a lot of different sorts of subtopics in history. Part of this is just like find your own adventure, and this will happen throughout all the museums. The third thing to look for, I'd actually suggest, are maps. This is part of every test. We'll have a few points of map identification questions because you have to have a kind of geographic literacy as well as a historical literacy. Notice that almost every room has a map, especially any one that introduces kind of a larger theme. Go back to those. That serves as a really useful review tool. Of course, we also have some apps that we'll talk about before the first exam. But those are 3 things to maybe look for. There are also timelines in many rooms. That's another way if the chronology part is a challenge for you. Museums can be helpful.
Well, and I want to put a finer point on what you said there, so I could simplify that into a line or 2 is don't feel like you have to read and listen to everything in there at the same time. Just because you finished the worksheet doesn't mean you've completed the museum.
That's a good
You should
summary.
explore a little more.
Yep. So I mentioned mastery terms, and here we're going to talk more about the exam on the next webisode, which is really a review webisode. But one thing I want to get people thinking about is in vocabulary, we distinguish between recognition terms, which is most of the terms. Can you recognize what it is? Can you put it on a map or a timeline? But some of them are we call mastery terms. And so we write about this in the first page of each study guide. But I think, Sam, the hardest thing for students to understand is, for a mastery term, we expect you all to be able to explain why is this significant. So I know you've answered this many times. How is that different from just describing something or defining something?
One way to think about it is can I describe how this connects into the bigger picture we're looking at, the bigger story we're looking at, the context we're looking at? I always tell students, if some of them are very obvious and you feel like, well, obviously I know why this is important, I'm just going to write that. That's great. If you feel like you know why something's important, great. If you feel like you need to unpack that a little more, it's a little trickier. There's 3 questions you can kind of ask as you're writing this out. And that's, I guess, the first point is write these things out. You should have a spot in a notebook where at minimum for the mastery terms, you have written out the term, the who, what, where, and then the significance. So here's the 3 questions I always ask if I struggle with significance. Why was this thing important in its own time, this person? Like, why were they important in the moment they were alive? What were their contributions, things like that. Second question is, why do they matter to us today? These mastery terms, the ones we're identifying that way, tend to have a long-standing significance, importance, meaning. So how do they not only affect their own time, but what about what they did affects things going forward?
Maybe even today.
Absolutely, yeah, right up to today. And thirdly, because this is Christianity and Western culture, it's sometimes helpful to ask, how does this thing impact Christianity? Now, this is especially important in the terms we've just done, because they kind of predate Christianity. So like you think about, well, what does Plato have to do with Christianity? Well, if you paid attention to what we said, actually quite a bit. You know, that there are some of the, in Socrates, Plato, some of these things, Alexander the Great, right, helps affect the world into which Christ is born, affects the New Testament world through Hellenization. Christ is born into a Hellenized world. So if I was writing a mastery term on Alexander, I would be thinking about, yeah, he conquered a bunch of stuff. Okay, he spread Greek culture. That's even better. But why does that matter? How does that play going forward? So sometimes significance, you have to look back. Right. Like, say, by the time we get to the test, I need to check some of those early significances to see, did this person come up again, or did their impact end up meaning more than I thought?
Right. So I think that's really important. We'll try to prep you for this on like your worksheet that's due the day of this webisode going out. We start by asking you, give us 3 significances pick 3 terms. It might not be clear to you like why Alexander the Great is relevant to Christianity, but there's a subsequent question on that worksheet that starts hinting at that a little bit. But at the same time, you might need to go back. And that's part of any kind of exam review is, you do material and then 3 weeks later you have a test. You've got to circle back to it. And maybe the significance becomes more clear with a little bit of hindsight. And also connection. So that's another kind of question you'll start seeing at a certain point, and it'll show up in the exam. How does one term connect to another? And sometimes you can't really see the significance until you put it side by side with another term as well. So I think another thing we'll do is the second segment of each webisode starting today will often really be about significance of vocab terms, of mastery terms. And we'll play different kinds of games. The webisode we do before each test will actually rank. 2 of us will take turns ranking what we think of as the 5 most significant terms.
And kind of making the case for that.
So that's kind of a last shot if you're having a hard time, that's a good way to get a little bit of a different take on what makes these significant. So we'll talk more about exam review in our next webisode. We'll talk about a few terms, a few readings in the second segment. But before we get there, Sam, we just got back from the continent of Europe. I think we had mentioned this in the first webisode. We spent almost 2 weeks in England, Belgium.
Are you still jet lagged?
I have been waking up at about 5:30 or 6 every morning.
Oh, that's not so bad. I've been waking up at 3.
Well, but you normally wake up at 4. So we're each like an hour ahead of time. Right. I feel like I'm on Nova Scotia time or something.
It's every day I get a couple minutes of sleep back. Yeah.
So Sam, I'll just ask you, this is kind of an adult alumni version of a trip we've done with Bethel students before. What's a takeaway you had from studying World War I and World War II in Europe in June versus January with 60-year-olds instead of 20-year-olds?
I have 2 that I'll mention. The first directly is about the wars, and that was going to Normandy. We've taken students there, but these are students whose maybe grandfathers fought in World War II and maybe were at Normandy or sometime after the D-Day invasion. But there's a kind of distance from that because not everybody knows their grandparents, so maybe these are just stories they've told, things like that. On this trip, we were there with people whose fathers fought in World War II, and that felt very different. And so we actually did a podcast where we interviewed folks, and they talked about their family's connections directly to this war, and those are far more immediate for those folks. So that was one. And in terms of a CWC connection, I went with one of the folks on the trip who was really interested in Christian history, and we visited Aldersgate Street in London, which is where in Unit 3 we'll talk about John Wesley, and Wesley has his conversion experience at this particular point. This guy was a big John Wesley fan, so I took him there, and that was just really cool to be able to sort of give a spiritual geography to a street that we were walking down. So that was really great.
Yeah, I thought a lot about this course on the trip. And then I got back and read the introductory discussion posts, and a lot of you talked about the fact you're looking forward to actually studying the history of Christianity. And maybe that's not something you've encountered in church or in classes before. And in a sense, that's a kind of family history too. Actually, my main takeaway is my parents went on the trip, and apart from one kind of medical emergency where I went home to be with my parents, it's the longest I've spent just the three of us together. And so it felt like a very family trip because of that. But in a sense, like when you take CWC, you're encountering the family history, right? You're encountering people who told the story that eventually made its way to your hearing as well. And so I think it's different. I mean, they don't feel like grandparents, relatives in that sense, but like these are part of your family tree. And maybe as we get closer and closer to our own time, you'll have a moment where you kind of feel something like that sense of, what Sam described of coming to Normandy. I mean, we'll come metaphorically, figuratively, to a place that in some way has shaped you, has made you who you are, traumatically or inspirationally, whatever it is. And so just be attentive to those moments. And we'll talk about how that happens for us as we go along too. Okay, we'll be back in just a moment. Amy will tap in for Sam, and we will talk a little bit more about the ancient world. Okay, we're back for segment 2. This is the segment where we play a game, which we're all looking forward to. But first, let's welcome back Amy Poppinga.
Oh, thanks.
To segment 2. So, Amy, we talked about Europe in the first segment. You were in a different part of the world for your June travels. Anything you want to share with us?
I visited the island of Oahu. This was my family's 4th trip to Hawaii, and so we've been in. I love Hawaii because there are different. I mean, the islands are different. And each one offers a different thing. This time we chose to stay in Oahu because my husband hadn't done any of sort of the historical aspects of American history in Hawaii, and my kids hadn't either, and they were at a great age to visit Pearl Harbor and to go on the battleship Missouri, and to they just both finished actually units in World War II at the end of their school years. And so it was actually awesome because they were at just the right age to I think know enough to be interested and to actually really appreciate what they were learning. And there's also quite a bit of just history then focused on U.S. involvement in the Pacific Theater in World War II. And at least in my, in my limited experience of World War II history, when I was a high school teacher, we tended to just always really overemphasize the European theater. It was like, we talk about Pearl Harbor, and then we pretty much do not return to the Pacific until the signing of the Japanese surrender on the battleship Missouri. So that was really cool because my kids actually knew quite a bit, but they also were they really learned a lot about the war in the Pacific Rim, which was kind of interesting.
So we've had very World War II heavy June so far. Let's go to a different time period in history. In the first couple days here on Online CWC, you've been exploring the ancient world, Greece, Rome, and to a limited extent, the Middle East. And so you've done some readings, you've been visiting a museum over the weekend. So we thought we'd step back, kind of wrap up the ancient world before we get to the early church and play a game we call Make the Case. So you're going to have 2 things to do after this game is done. One is you're going to make your own case. That'll be the discussion board post that we'll get to after we've done our version of this. And then we're also going to ask you to judge us and evaluate us and vote on which one of us did a better job making the case. So the way this works is we have 3 pairs of terms in a sense. So this is also another chance for you to get a sense of the significance of some terms, understand some readings. We are going to force a choice on ourselves. So we've just got sealed envelopes. We don't know what's in them. We've got to be able to make an argument for whichever envelope we get in response to whatever the question is. So we'll have 3 of these. You will judge us at the end. Go on Moodle, vote for who won.
So we're going to pose a question. We each are going to argue the opposite side. Please keep in mind when you are choosing who you're voting for. I mean, this is not a popularity
We don't get
contest.
to decide.
No,
we're stuck
this is about who is making the better argument here. I want you to know this can get ugly. It's a stiff competition. It is not that we are friends, but so this is kind of hard for us. But I'm dedicated to the academic exercise that we're modeling here, and so
I don't enjoy arguing Amy about this. That's
me
not
either.
fun at all.
This is not
so
fun, but
I
care about your learning.
That's right. It's what it's
all about. And remember that when you're voting.
Okay, so we're going to start with ancient philosophy. Students who had some readings from the philosophers Plato and Aristotle.
And we are both experts
in
ancient philosophy.
We don't need actual philosophers here. We've got historians of the 20th century in the Islamic world. Okay, so we are going to make the case for which of these 2 philosophers is more important for Christians to wrestle with.
Okay. For Christians now, because neither of these people, let's be clear,
this is hundreds of years before Christ.
Before Christianity.
Haven't read either Testament.
It's worth pointing out.
Amy, do you want to pick yours? So I think we should go chronologically. Let's start with the teacher, who would be Plato, and then we'll do the student. Aristotle. So These are hard envelopes. So what
They
did
are.
Sam do?
We didn't steal them. Okay.
All right. Who do I
I
have?
will be making an argument.
Okay, you go
for
first.
Plato,
And
so
then
I
I will
get
do
to go
Aristotle.
first.
So,
Yes. Well,
Amy, why is Plato the more significant philosopher for Christians to grapple with?
Well, I'd like to start with the famous quote. I don't know who said it. Everything else in philosophy is just a footnote to Plato.
I think that'd be Alfred North Whitehead.
Oh, you are
I don't know if I just lost or gained
up
notes
early.
with that.
It was just up early. Yes, I didn't know that. Whatever, but I knew the quote. And so, really, Plato is the backbone of all of Western philosophy. And as you hopefully are, I mean, one of the most important things we want for a student to be able to do is to distinguish between Platonic thought and Aristotelian thought, because we'll keep coming back to them. And that's why the question is, which one is the most important for Christians? And so understand that my answer here is not based on Plato in this grander sense, but rather specifically for us as Christians. One of Plato's central concepts is the idea that when we're trying to understand truth, when we're trying to understand values and virtue, we have to push past what we can observe around us. And he says we have to be looking for something higher. Mm-hmm. And this is sort of where the brain kicks in and begins the exercise of saying, well, what is beyond what I can observe? For example, Plato would make the argument that I'm probably in a better position. Well, you don't know what that's. But that's another point. But that I'm in a better position to think about not just like the ideal form of, say, something like some of what is beautiful than, for example, like a child when they're 5. Okay, right? But that I'm going to be able to rely upon. I'm going to be able to rely upon my experience, but I'm going to also be able to use my intellect and to use my sort of like higher intellectual power. It's what separates me from an animal. I can sit beside a lion, a very tame one that's been trained by, like people in a zoo, and I can say, hey, lion, let's sit here all day and let's think about what does truth mean? What does beauty mean? What does honor mean? What does courage mean? I have the ability to think on a much higher level than, say, my counterpart here, the lion. And Plato calls us to that. And he says you have that ability to do that. And so you have to exercise your mind to engage in that. Why that's so important for Christians is because as Christians, we are held to a higher set of standards. But if I were to say, well, where is that set of standards? Yes, certainly we could look to the Bible to say, what does Scripture have to say about that? And at the same time, we know that there are communities that are Christian all throughout history who aren't literate, who aren't reading the Bible for themselves. And the Bible always has to be understood within its time and context. So why it is key and central to how I guide my life as a person, God has also gifted me, I believe, as a Christian, with the ability to say, I have to do this work for myself. I rely on prayer. I rely on like intellectual engagement, but I say, well, what am I called to as a Christian? And when I engage these ideas of courage, honor, valor, virtue, what it means to be a good person, what it means to be a good citizen, while I can certainly look at society around me, as Christians, we are called to something higher. And that which is higher is often not something which is observable. If I were to say as a Christian, what does it mean for me to love my brother Chris, my brother in Christ Chris? Sure, there's some tangible things we could look at, but I would say, what does the whole concept of lay down my life for you mean? Well, we can look at it in a literal sense, but if Plato, who is not Christian, and as we said, predates Christianity, were to say, okay, Amy, what does that mean? I would say, well, I'm going to use some of your thinking, and what I'm going to say that means is lay down my life for you means I put you before myself. I put my own needs aside, which is certainly not probably like a current societal value, and I say, what does it mean? Yes, potentially literally, but what does it mean intellectually for me to lay down my life for you? What does it mean emotionally? What does it mean spiritually? So for me, like everything does sort of start with Plato, and Aristotle as a student can argue and critique it, which is a good thing, and we would want, any good teacher would want a student to do that. But there is no Aristotle without Plato. Take it away.
Yeah, I mean, part of me would love to have the Plato. I mean, early Christian thinkers.
Let's not do that. Let's not.
Early Christian thinkers thought so highly of Plato. Some of them thought that he had been inspired in the same way the Hebrew prophets have been inspired. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of what Plato is saying about looking beyond this world fits really well with early Christians who expect the imminent return of Christ, don't think this is it. There's something beyond this world. But that's exactly why I think Aristotle is more important, because I think in some ways Plato feeds some dangerous tendencies within Christianity. Plato, because he's pointing up beyond this world, might encourage us to think that what happens down here doesn't matter, right? And we might tend to forget God created the physical world. So We'll talk about a group called the Gnostics on the other side of this webisode who take Platonic philosophy so seriously they believe the physical world is a trap, a prison created by a different deity, and our job is to escape from it. And every time you hear a Christian say that the task of the church is to get people to heaven, I think we risk minimizing the importance of what God has created and called very good. And Aristotle, in the reading you have called Parts of Animals, would look at Amy's friend the lion and say, well, you might not be as intellectually gifted as this particular creature, but there is still something wonderful. And Aristotle even starts to hint that if we study things that are observable and accessible down here and study them rigorously, we might actually be able to find the form in the object itself. And it might even hint towards something beyond this world, although again, not a Christian, has kind of different theories about the nature of God. But there's something powerful about the idea we should take seriously the physical, observable, material world. We shouldn't neglect it. We shouldn't deride it. And actually, if you're a sciences student, this should really sound familiar to you. You find something in the beauty of this world, in the order of this world. And that's a way of honoring God too. The second thing I'd say, the second reading is about the nature of virtues. Amy mentioned some of the virtues that generally the Greeks would affirm, things like honor and wisdom and courage. Aristotle, I think, is really helpful to us in thinking about, well, why are those important and how do we cultivate those virtues? He doesn't think they're innate. They're things that require practice and habituation. I always compare this to athletics. The reason a great athlete can kick a goal in the Women's World Cup is because they've done it 10,000 times before. Well, likewise, if we're to be courageous or prudent or wise persons, we've got to practice that. The problem that creates for Christians, and the reason we should wrestle with that reading, is we also have to grapple with sin. And we might realize that we can practice all we want, and there's still something limiting us, whether it's an intellectual kind of virtue or another kind of virtue. But I think, again, that's why he's so important, because there's something powerful in his idea of this kind of moderate path to practiced virtue that we can both admire and also struggle with.
Gosh, I've missed teaching. I'm sitting here listening to you, and I'm like, now I want to argue for Aristotle, because I think a lot of what I just found in what you said was, I always think about how in the emphasis on Aristotle, there is there's an accessibility and a fairness in the sense that, I'm reading it back in history to Aristotle, but the idea that, again, from an educational standpoint, from a gender standpoint, from a social hierarchy standpoint, like the observable creates a type of commonality, and emphasis on the ideal forms can often be limited to those that are in positions of power, or those that are in positions of wealth, or those that in society were deemed human when others weren't. So the ways in which these work together are just beautiful. And, and like exploring the whole idea even of like accountability and how, like, what does accountability mean? How do you define accountability or think of an ideal form of accountability in a Platonic sense without the Aristotelian, like how that actually plays out and what's observable?
So I think the takeaway is that Aristotle wins. Okay, let's move on to the second make the case question. Kind of a similar sort of question, and we're going to look at one more philosopher, but then a very different kind of non-Greek figure. Which is the better model for Christians, Socrates or Judas Maccabeus? Amy?
Okay.
I'll go first.
Yeah, you go first.
So whoever it is, I will kick us off this time. And that means I will be arguing for Socrates. So I get the teacher of Plato, and so the, intellectual grandfather of Aristotle. So why is Socrates a better model? Here again, Socrates was widely admired by the early church. And I think the best way to think about it is that there's a martyr named Polycarp. And you'll hear more about him, I think, from Mike Holmes in the next museum. Polycarp, when he dies, actually indirectly quotes Socrates. And Polycarp says, Christ has given himself to me. How can I turn my back on him at this point? Socrates said the same thing about the city-state of Athens. Athens made me who I was. I can't abandon it now. And it cost him his life. He drinks poison and commits suicide as a result of a completely, undoubtedly unjust punishment by the city-state of Athens. So why is that a good model for Christians? In a sense, it seems like that's abetting injustice. I think it starts with, well, why was Socrates there? Why was he being tried? Well, because he asked difficult questions of young people, which obviously resonates with college professors.
Corrupting the youth.
That's right, and he attracts the attention of the people in power who don't want their kids asking hard questions about an Athens that's going into decline and reversal and abandoning its convictions. I think that's certainly appealing for Christians, that we should not be afraid, even if it brings us to that point of our physical life being in danger, we should not be afraid to ask hard questions in the confidence, first of all, that we're probably wrong about them. Right? Socrates is this brilliant man, but what makes him truly wise is he knows he doesn't have the answers, but at the same time, he is convinced that the answers can be found. Unlike the sophists, who are these other teachers who think the only thing that matters is can you convince people to believe something. Socrates thinks there actually is truth, but it takes really hard questions to get at it, right? And so that's, I think, admirable. At the end, though, what I think makes him so admirable is this willingness to sacrifice. And it's hard because it feels like an unjust death, right? It feels like he wasted his life. I mean, it seems clear he could have just gone to exile for 10 years. This is disillusioning to Plato. It's one reason Plato hates the Athenian democracy so much. But I think there is a kind of humility here of saying maybe as an individual, my life doesn't matter that much. Maybe what's necessary is for the good of the community. And I don't know, like it's hard for me to say that Socrates' death was good for Athens, right? But it's also hard for me to say that Polycarp's death was good for the church in that part of the world, but it at least forces us to grapple with the relative importance of one individual's life versus the larger health of the community. And so, again, in the sense of forcing us to wrestle with difficult questions, Socrates is an important model. What about Judas Maccabees?
All right. So I have Judas Maccabees, and so for me, actually, CWC was probably the first place that I actually encountered or knew more about the story, other than maybe like Saturday Night Live skits. But a super interesting figure who is important in both the like the literal history of Israel as well as sort of the historical and like intellectual history of Israel. And Judas Maccabees, who is singled out as in his role in Jewish history for overthrowing the oppressive government that the Jewish population had lived under various different oppressors for. At this point in history, it had been a couple of centuries where the Jewish community, which is tied to their own history of being this great this great nation. And when we say nation, we're not talking about a geographic boundary per se, but rather this group of people, the nation of Israel. And that at this point in time, when, again, after like centuries of oppression, the Jewish population is looking for the Savior. They are looking for, based on the prophetic tradition, they're looking for someone who is going to come and who is going to free them from the oppressor. And today when we read, as a modern Christian, when I read about freedom from oppression in the Bible, I'm often thinking of, for myself, because of being a privileged person in the West, I'm not thinking about like freedom from a literal oppressor. I'm thinking about it maybe more in the abstract. But this community at this point in time is looking for a literal freedom from the oppressor, that they will again be an independent nation, that they will be able to govern themselves. And in particular at this point in time, while they have lived, I don't want to say like a peaceful, harmonious existence, they've been allowed to exist, and a central part of their existence is being able to live out their religious beliefs and their religious practices, because they are deeply tied to practice. And for Judaism to carry forward from generation to generation, it must happen in community. It's a religious practice that's based in an orthoprax tradition. You need community, and a lot of it's based on ritual. And at this point in history, what has happened is that has become increasingly under scrutiny, to the point where now they are facing direct discrimination through like physical and other types of acts towards them that are violent and otherwise. And so Judas Maccabees, who has a large family structure, rises up and starts a revolt against their oppressors and is successful. And so I don't want to get to the details don't matter, and I'm sorry because it was a little long-winded there, but while it is successful and the population does regain control over themselves, it does not last for a particularly long period of time, but it is something that has continued to have importance both through Jewish holidays and other traditions of saying, this is when we rose up against our oppressor. We are the minority group. And what pushed us to the breaking point was when the oppression really started to limit our religious and spiritual practice, when it got to the point that blasphemy is occurring. And so why I think a figure like Judas Maccabees is so important, and a little bit difficult in the contrast to say like Socrates, but I sort of feel like, well, here's your man of the people. On the one hand, you could say Socrates is a man of the people, but he's a man of certain people. And when we look at, and Judas Maccabees just stands out maybe as one of the first, and now what's going to be a long line of people who within their religious minority community stand up and say, we're not going to take it anymore. that emphasis on action and the emphasis on doing something, and if we want to go back to talking about Aristotle versus Plato, it's like, well, we've got Plato and Aristotle at work in what's happening with Judas Maccabees, in the sense that this was fighting for, and I think truly believing that you were the fulfillment of a prophetic of a prophecy. That can be really dangerous. And at the same time, history needs not only prophets, they need the people that fulfill those prophecies. So when I think of someone like Martin Luther King Jr., and an interesting example, because Martin Luther King Jr., we know, essentially dies as a martyr for the church, not giving himself up as one, but rather having his life taken from him. I think Martin Luther King Jr. in particular would say, we need more of these guys. We need more of the people who say, if not now, when? And while, and that's, I think, a refrain that we see throughout history, that, like, often people who are attempting to actually create change are told, it's just not the right time. It's not the right time. Your ideas are important. Your ideas are good, but it's not the right time, and we're not in the right position. And so I think that Judas Maccabees is sort of more of a man of the people who says, if not now, then when? And his legacy, continues to have resonance as a time when people who were the minority and had become so used to being the oppressed rose up against the oppressor.
Yeah, I think we probably have an easier time liking Martin Luther King Jr.'s version because it's nonviolent, right? This is violent.
Let's put it in its historical context, Chris.
No, but I want to say, like, we'll actually see versions of this. We'll talk about, for example, a peasants' revolt in what's now Germany in the 16th century that leads to violence. I'm actually reading David Blight's biography of Frederick Douglass right now. And one of the central themes that Douglass wrestles with is he personally does not commit violence very often after he flees slavery. He doesn't feel called to fight himself, but he believes that God is entering into history apocalyptically to bring about justice.
Right,
and especially in the Civil War, he urges it. He actually, it's very uncomfortable to read. Like, Douglass finds violence redemptive. Slaveholding needs to be crushed and slaveholders killed, and that's very hard to read in a sense, but I'm also not an African American who had been enslaved at the time. I was part of the oppressive group, right? And I think I feel the same way reading Judas Maccabees a little bit. Like, it's easy for us to say, well, we shouldn't be violent, right? And at the same time, there might be moments where, I don't know if I want to say where we need to act violent, but I think, like, the points you raised are really important. What does it actually mean to act in accordance with God's word, to act in accordance with the prophetic tradition when you are the oppressed people, not the oppressor people? And so, again, at least someone Christian should wrestle with. Okay, we need to get to our third set, and we'll try to do this quickly. This is not really so much about Christianity, but more about Western culture, as we think about how we continue to be influenced by these very distant events. Amy, which is the more influential form of government for American government today, the Roman Republic or the Athenian democracy? Do you want to do Athens first, or you just want to go first?
Oh, no, I think we should go historically. So you,
okay. So they're actually both founded about the same time. I'll take Athenian democracy because that's kind of the order we treat them.
I guess my point is this is still going, and that we teach with.
Yeah, so Athens becomes a democracy, this one of many city-states in Greece, just before 500 BC. And so democracy is just from the Greek for power to the people. In that sense, like that's, we just heard, like a people's champion, right? That resonates with Americans, someone who argues for the people. The people have the power. It's not just a small aristocratic elites. I mean, Athens, they're so concerned about breaking up power that anyone can be exiled for 10 years, even their best and brightest, right? Just to make it harder for one small group to dominate the entire city. And so I think it's really important for us in the sense that it gives us this notion of citizenship being a mass phenomenon, that no one in a healthy political system really ought to be inert or passive or silent. Now, the problem with Athens, right, is the vast majority of people there are not citizens. Women, enslaved people, foreigners, they are silent. Right?
And I don't remember what percentage. Do you remember what percentage of the Athenian population is probably actually?
I mean, there may be 150,000 people, and maybe 25,000 are full active citizens. This is a small minority, but it gives us the kernel of the idea that a healthy polity is one in which the people are engaged. Whether that's, we don't do the direct participatory, like not all Americans every March go to Washington and decide who to exile, right? Like like that wouldn't work, although maybe the internet will permit something like this. But it does give us the idea we need to be...
do it from the comfort of our own home.
Right, but now it does give us the idea that, in a sense, like, we really ought to be engaged deeply. We ought to be informed. We ought to care. We're all part of this. And I think that's a very powerful idea. So going back to the Frederick Douglass biography, I mean, the section where it's 1863, not only is the Emancipation Proclamation been issued, but Douglass is exhorting African Americans to join the Union Army, partly because he's concerned now about demonstrating that they are citizens, that they're not simply the passive recipients of some gift from Abraham Lincoln, but they are Americans. And he has a kind of turn in his language where he suddenly says, this is not a foreign nation, this is our nation, and we need to participate in it. And I thought of Athens a little bit. And part of the trajectory of history then is expanding that citizenship to people who have been excluded, especially women, which will take us all the way through this course. We'll just start to get to it at the very end of the course. But I think we inherit that from Athens in a sense.
Did you say expanding citizenship? I think you did.
I did.
And so, I mean, I agree with everything that you said. And so the idea of engagement with government in particular, like engagement with society, that what makes for a strong society is one where citizens see themselves as participants in what does or does not happen, and thus like make decisions and kind of have an active engagement with what's going on. And I also agree with your idea of government being representative of the population and of the people. I would say that the Roman Republic takes that idea much further in terms of that representation, in terms of the system. There's I think, a more developed system of checks and balances in the ways that decisions are made. By no means arguing this is a perfect model, because it is not, because again, we think like there's the exclusion of women as well. However, while both of these societies are societies where slavery exists and where slavery is really essential to both of these systems working, an advantage of the Roman Republic is that the Romans were much more open to foreigners. And so the Roman Republic is more open to, I think, like you can kind of see as you look at Roman history, cultural shifts and cultural changes as they are a bit more fluid with receiving foreigners and the influence that has, the ways in which it helps to extend trade, the ways in which it makes for a richer republic, both in terms of financial resources, but also in terms of, again, like cultural achievements, advancements in technology, all of these different types of things. And so that willingness and openness to foreigners who could actually become citizens, which is not the case with Athenian democracy, is going to make something that, while it's going to turn into empire, this model of what we think of as the Roman world is certainly going to last far longer. Its geographic reach is going to be much further because it isn't as exclusive. I mean, I think that's actually the huge downfall of why we don't, why Athens as an empire doesn't. I mean, it's a long-standing empire and one we should study, but why it didn't have the length that the Romans did is because of that inclusive aspect of the Roman Republic. And again, when I say inclusive, I just want to laugh at myself because it's an inclusivity as one would think of it at this particular point.
Well, the fact that someone like the Apostle Paul could be a Roman citizen, right? A Jew from what's now Turkey has the rights of a Roman citizen.
Exactly. Yeah. So and that's what I also think is interesting about when we look at the writings of Paul is that, again, it really creates these interesting issues of thinking about a Christian's relationship to government because, again, like Paul is saying, be different. You need to, Christians are held to a higher standard, a higher ideal, but he's also not saying, throw this system out, it's crap, it's oppressive. He's saying, like, work within this system, which to me is, and while Paul is certainly pushing the edges in many ways, so I'm not saying Paul is like this lover of the ways in which Rome works, and it's not Republic at that point. However, there is a safety and a stability that comes, we'll just repeat that word, with a stable government, like in terms of keeping people safe and keeping people fed and keeping people educated and keeping people healthy as well. So,
well, I think what you say about Paul wrestling with that sets up where we're about to go, because you're about to read from a later Roman Christian figure named Augustine, who will say, in a sense, our citizenship is not in this world.
Right.
And yet we are citizens of societies, polities, economies down here. So look for that as we come to our next couple assignments. Your actual next assignment, though, is kind of two-part. The one that you don't have to do, but it's kind of fun, is vote for which of us you thought did a better job making the case over these three disputes. The one you do have to do is you have one more discussion. Your next discussion board post is due on Tuesday morning by 10 o'clock. What we'd like you to do is to make the case for, get it right, of all the people you've encountered in the ancient world, Greece, Rome, Israel, which has the most to teach us as 21st century American Christians?
So put Christianity, think about Christianity in our current context. Who's speaking to us? Who could we learn from? How could it be applied?
Yeah, so this could be a reading you've had. It could be someone you encounter in the film somehow. It could be someone you met in the museum. But you've got to pick a particular person from the course to this point from the ancient world and explain to us what you think they have to teach us. Now, this could be more of like a discussion thread. The first one was really introduce yourself. That's kind of particular to you. If someone has already written about the person you want to write about, don't start a new thread.
Right,
respond to what they said.
To it, pick it up and run with
it.
it.
Affirm something they've said, but maybe add a new argument. So we give you some criteria on Moodle itself to give you some sense of what we're looking for in like a 5-point answer versus a 4 or 3-point answer. But have some fun with this. We'll try to engage a little bit as well. And that will be a nice kind of cap on the ancient world before we head into the birth of Christ, beginning of his ministry, and what we call the early church.
We're excited to see what you come up with.
We're back. It is happy time, Amy.
Yeah, well, very special today. Happy birthday to Chris's wife, Katie, who is definitely not turning 40. I don't know how old she is, but it is not 40. Sam, as people who have already, I mean, like, Katie's not turning 40, but
right.
You've turned 40, I've turned 40, your wife has turned 40. Any gift suggestions, just in case Chris has yet to buy one?
Well, I think when you approach 40, but maybe not turn 40 yet, I think you reach a point in life where you're less interested in things and you're more interested in experiences. Maybe. You're a fan of the theater, are you not?
Theater.
Do you remember what won the 1966 Tony for Best Musical?
No.
Okay. This is going to play into this. Because what I think is great is community theater. Because when you go to community theater and it's good, it's pretty good.
Yeah, no, I agree.
But when you go to community theater and it's not good, it's
even
awesome.
Better. It is even better.
I think Chris should get tickets to Man of La Mancha, put on by the Mounds View Community Theater. It's playing from July 19th to August 4th.
Ooh, lots of time.
Yeah, good seats available.
Good seats available.
I think that's a great gift.
Oh, I love it.
You can do a fun dinner before. You can maybe recommend a restaurant, but doesn't that sound
Culver's.
great? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Right on.
For sure. That sounds great.
All right. Happy anniversary, Amy. O Canada is first performed on this day in 1880. Wow, I didn't realize it was that old. Amy, what is the most important contribution that our northern neighbor has made to Christianity and or Western culture?
How? My leg hurts. What is that? It's a growing pain. The most important contribution? Alan Thicke. Absolutely. Alan Thicke, who plays the father on Growing Pains. One of my favorite sitcoms, and I know yours, from the 1988?
Before that, like 80,
really?
85, 86.
Like
and since we're getting, all right,
Please,
maybe do you have more
it.
Alan Thicke trivia here?
Well, I mean, I was going to, no.
No, go ahead. You go first.
No, I don't really have more Alan
Okay,
Thicke
and
trivia.
if you're a fan of 80s sitcoms, he also wrote the theme songs to Different Strokes and The Facts of Life.
And Family Ties.
I don't think he wrote the Family Ties one.
Are you sure? Why do you have to be such a nerd too? Okay, but Facts of Life for sure.
Were any of you alive in the 80s? Probably not.
No, but like, can't you watch
It's all
Growing
streaming
Pains?
now.
Is it? I was
It's all
going to say.
streaming. Go to
He
YouTube.
was like my favorite TV dad. He was a psychiatrist. My stepdad was a psychiatrist, is still. But I mean, Alan Thicke was, my stepdad is. But he was just like my favorite TV dad. So when I think, it was like, was it going to be Wayne Gretzky?
No.
Like, or Alan Thicke, or isn't Michael J. Fox, is he Canadian too?
They're all
I
Canadian.
think they are all Canadian. All 80s sitcoms, it was like a quota. You start with a Canadian, and then you build the whole show
That's right.
around it.
It's a solid formula.
It is a solid formula. Yeah, that's what I would offer. Yeah, most definitely. So, all right, well, happy trails to the Anabaptist radicals who took over the German city of Münster. I wish Chris was here to say that. They were forced to flee this day in 1535 while their leaders were tortured and executed. Sam, we're going to talk about the Münster fiasco at the Münster cheese, delish, at the end of Unit 2. What's something else in that unit that students should already be eager to learn about?
Well,
like when they're going into the weekend and they're like trying to find conversation with their friends, I'm excited to learn about blah.
As I was listening to you guys talk about Plato and Aristotle, all I could think of is, I can't wait till we get to Aquinas. Because as monumental as they are in Greek philosophy, Aquinas is this pinnacle of medieval philosophy. I love Aquinas. I love reading some Aquinas.
So yeah, that's I'm going to say.
You know what I'm
Aquinas.
going to bring in for you
What's
next
that?
week? Because a good friend of mine, Carrie Peffley, who teaches in the philosophy department, just got together with Carrie, just got back from a big European trip, just got a picture of herself taken by the history department's own Charlie Goldberg, of her in front of Aquinas' tomb.
Oh,
bring that for
that's
you.
really touching.
I thought it was kind of creepy, but I'm going to bring it for you.
All right, Amy, it's time for the big finish. So
Okay.
remember, discussion posts.
Yes.
Get on there. Make sure you answer. Make sure you interact with other
June
people.
25th by 10 a.m.
Right, this is the time to interact with us. So vote on Make the Case. I know
Yep.
I wasn't part of it. I listened. The arguments were great. They were flying. Who do you think won? You'll go point by point on each one
Yep.
of those Make the Case. Who do you think won? Remember, if you have questions, email us. We'll do one more of these before exam one, but
Yep.
but so
and that's
email
an
us.
important one.
That's
Lots
right.
a good exam review.
That's
happens
right.
in
So
that.
anything else that you
Yeah.
want to say to our students?
No, I think we got it this week.
All right, so I will close the show by reminding you to allow flash.